If one day you walked into the place you once called home, but were treated like a stranger, what would you do? That afternoon, Mrs. Grace Thompson, a woman of color in her 70s, quietly walked into the Golden Spoon restaurant, where she and her husband had celebrated their birthdays for decades. But today, the warm eyes of the waiters were gone. Instead, there was the cold voice of a young waiter named Ethan. Sorry, the restaurant is full. No one asked if she had made a reservation. No one realized the insult wrapped in the words "no tables." In the midst of that splendor, Grace stood there between two choices: leave in silence, or stay to see how far the truth would go. If it were you, when your dignity was touched, would you choose to stay calm or demand justice? Come with me as we walk through Grace's story, where justice comes not with a scream, but with a silence that makes the world listen. If you believe that human dignity has no skin color, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can start this story together. Outside the Golden Spoon restaurant, the afternoon sunlight slid down the rain-soaked pavement, reflecting off the gilded sign that still shone brightly as ever. Mrs. Grace Thompson stopped in front of the glass door. Each step she took seemed to carry decades of memories: birthday evenings with her husband, laughter in a warm space where each employee affectionately called her Mama Grace. Today was her 72nd birthday. No big party, no flowers, no cake. She just wanted to sit at her usual corner table by the window, order a cup of black tea and a simple meal the same way she did every year, to remind herself that there were things in life that were more enduring than time. But when the door opened, a cold wind blew back memories. None of the familiar faces were there. No more. Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson. Instead, there was a luxurious but cold space. The light clink of knives and forks on china, the dripping of conversation, and an atmosphere that was hard to name: cold, polite, and distant. A waiter passed by, his white shirt crisp, his perfume strong enough to overpower the scent of the soup. He didn't look at her or ask any questions. She stood still for a few seconds, as if she had wandered into a place she didn't belong. One moment, she wondered, maybe I really have grown old. The world changes, but I remain. But no, she was still Grace Thompson, the woman who had seen her husband, Richard Thompson, grow from a small cook to the founder of this restaurant. After his death, her son, David, took over and turned it into a symbol of sophistication, of love, of family. The Golden Spoon had been home in every sense of the word. But today, in the eyes of the young people serving her, she was just another old stranger. She walked to the front desk. The girl on duty looked up, her face carefully made up, but lifeless. "Excuse me. I have a reservation. My name is Grace Thompson." Her voice was soft, tired, but still steady. The girl glanced at the computer screen, hesitant. Let me see. Maybe the waitress can help." No eye contact, no smile, just a disjointed sentence. Then she turned to someone else. She stood there, her hand on her small purse. The atmosphere in the restaurant was still, as if she were an invisible void. Then a young man appeared, Ethan. White shirt, black tie, quick, sure gait. She recognized that look, the look of people who think they are above others. "Excuse me," she said. "I have a reservation." "Name is Ethan," interrupted, without looking at the list. "Sorry, we're full, ma'am." The words were short, cold, and utterly indifferent. A smile crossed her lips, but it wasn't from joy. She had seen more than that in her life. That smile was the last shield of those accustomed to prejudice. She asked again, gently, Could you double-check for me? I made a reservation yesterday." Ethan shrugged. "No need to check. I know for sure." His voice held a hint of arrogance, as if she had just interrupted his workday. There was a long silence. The jazz music in the restaurant was still playing, but now it was harsh. In that moment, Grace suddenly remembered the first time she walked into a restaurant nearly 50 years ago. She was young, newly married, and refused service because she was black. She had told Richard, "One day we're going to have our own place, a place where anyone, no matter what color, can smile." And the golden spoon was that dream. But today, in that very same place, she heard the same words. No one remembered who she was. No one knew that the silver-haired woman was the mother of the owner who ran this restaurant. A young customer walked by, glanced, then avoided her eyes. She knew the look mixed with shyness, with apprehension, and a touch of unconscious prejudice. Ethan turned and walked away. She watched him, her eyes not angry, only sad. She slowly sat down on a chair near the door, not to disturb, just to observe. Every gesture, every look, every word in that space seemed to be telling her, "You don't belong here anymore." But she knew. Justice doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be seen. And sometimes, the truth reveals itself when people try to hide it. A drop of water fell on the back of her hand, maybe from the glass, or from the corner of her eye. But she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she smiled slightly, adjusted her scarf, and said softly, as if to herself, "Dignity is something that no one can take away, unless you let it go yourself." The audience, if they had witnessed that moment, would have seen a small woman in a magnificent space. But her gaze was strangely steady. No need for excuses, no need for anger. She just sat there, calm, as if giving the world a chance to see itself. No one knew that in a few minutes, that silence would make the whole restaurant bow their heads. But just when Grace thought it would end there, the young waiter, Ethan, turned back. His eyes filled with contempt, and their fateful meeting began. The restaurant was silent, save for the yellow light that cast a glow over the white tablecloths. The sound of spoons clinking against glasses echoed in the distance. Grace Thompson sat there, her posture erect, her hand resting lightly on her old leather handbag. Everything around her seemed to move more slowly, as if time were testing her patience. And then, Ethan turned around. He didn't approach with the courtesy of a waiter, but with the confident gait of someone who was in control. In the reflected light, Ethan's face exuded a characteristic coolness. His eyes didn't look directly at him, just glanced, enough to assess. "Are you still here?" he asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Mrs." Grace raised her head slightly, her smile as thin as a thread, polite to the point of being unappealing. "Yes. I said I had a reservation. I just wanted to confirm." Ethan sighed, a short but meaningful sigh. Another grumpy old man. He glanced at the reservation list, but only did so perfunctorily, flipping through a few lines before closing the book without looking closely. "Your name isn't on it. I told you, we're fully booked today." His voice was flat, but there was something sharper than coldness in it, a thin, almost unconscious layer of prejudice. Grace inclined her head. She did not ask any more questions, nor argue. Her eyes held the calm light that only those who had suffered injustice could maintain. "Are you sure?" she asked again, her voice as light as the wind. Ethan pursed his lips, nodded, and turned away. The scene, seen from the outside, seemed small and insignificant, but in the way he turned away, There was an invisible system at work, the arrogance of youth, the belief that one had the right to decide who was worthy of service and who was not. A new group of guests entered, two white men, dressed elegantly. Ethan immediately changed his tone. "Hello, gentlemen. This way, please." He bowed, a smile appearing just in time. Grace watched, her eyes not sad, not angry, just recognition. That was the moment she understood that prejudice never dies. It just changes its appearance, more refined, more polite, and wrapped in the shell of norms. Ethan returned after showing the guests to their tables. She was still sitting there, her hand still on her bag, looking quiet as if waiting for something to happen. "You're not leaving yet." Ethan's voice was colder, but also somewhat confused. She just looked at him. Calmly, "I think I'll wait for your manager. He probably knows better who booked the table today." The sentence was not loud, not emphasized, but it resonated like a light touch to the young waiter's pride. Ethan smiled half-heartedly, his voice sarcastic. "Do you think the manager has time for such a small matter?" A few nearby diners began to notice. They couldn't hear the whole thing, but the tension was palpable. A middle-aged woman at the next table glanced over, her eyes a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. Grace, meanwhile, remained in her original position, sitting upright, her eyes trained on the table, as if she were talking to herself rather than to him. Something in Ethan's mind was bothering him. Maybe it was the woman's composure. Maybe it was the fact that he felt seen through, even though he hadn't been criticized. Ethan had grown up in a small town where everyone white believed they understood the world better than everyone else. He'd come to the city, worked at this famous restaurant, and believed he was a new class. But that only made him more afraid of losing that fragile position, and in the presence of someone like Grace, that insecurity turned to arrogance. "Maybe you should try somewhere else," he said, his voice low but loud enough for her to hear. "Here, we have our own standards." A seemingly innocuous remark, but enough to slice the air in the room into thin slices. "Mrs.?" Grace looked up, her eyes meeting his lightly. No anger, no resistance, just a look that made one want to avoid. "I understand," she said slowly, "but sometimes the standard isn't in the menu, but in how people treat each other." Ethan was confused and said nothing more. He turned away, but there was still a strange feeling in his heart, as if he had just looked in a mirror, and the person in the mirror was someone he did not want to see. Grace sat for a while. No one asked questions. No one served her water. The once warm space became a test of her dignity, and then she stood up gently. She didn't leave, she just moved closer to the counter, where the electronic reservation book was. "Can I see today's list?" she asked, her voice soft as a breath. Ethan glanced at her, hesitated, then said, "No, ma'am." There was a pause. She just nodded. "So how long have you been working here?" she asked, as if she wanted to make conversation. "Your second week." "Oh, I see. There must be a lot to learn." Her voice was warm and calm, but it made Ethan pause. There was no preaching in her eyes, only the light of someone who had experienced, and that made him feel small. A bar patron leaned over and whispered to his friend, "That must be the boss's mother." Ethan overheard, his heart racing. He turned to look at Grace. The woman was still standing there, still calm as if she hadn't heard anything. He swallowed and took a step back. The door to the manager's office opened slightly. A middle-aged man, Mr. Collins, appeared. He saw Mrs. Grace, and in an instant his face changed from indifference to surprise. Collins' gaze made the atmosphere in the restaurant freeze. Ethan didn't understand what was happening, but his instinct told him that things had just taken a different turn, where justice was beginning to speak, albeit in silence. Mr. Colin's eyes met Mrs. Grace Thompson's, and his face changed slightly, just for a moment, but enough for Ethan to realize something was wrong. The manager walked quickly over, his voice trying to stay calm. Excuse me, ma'am. Can I help you? Grace turned around, her gaze gentle, as if she had just escaped a cold wind. I made a reservation, but it seems the young waiter here couldn't find my name. Her voice was calm, not reproachful, but each word made one feel the weight of politeness. Ethan took a step back, feeling everyone's eyes starting to turn towards him. He didn't know how to react, so he just said, I checked. Her name isn't on the list. The air seemed to freeze. Mrs. Grace said nothing more. Mr. Collins glanced at Ethan, then flipped open the list on the screen after a few seconds. The name Grace Thompson, 6:00 p.m. Window seat appeared clearly. His face paled. Madam, I am so sorry. There must have been a mistake. Please follow me. Your table is ready. His voice was soft, trying to soothe, but Mrs. Grace just shook her head slightly. No need, she said softly. I just want to understand why he didn't check before saying, no table. Ethan looked up, as if backed into a corner. He wanted to say something, but couldn't find the right words. Ma'am, I was just... She cut him off with a thread-like smile. Just doing my job. Right. Ethan nodded, but in her eyes it was no longer a question. It was like a mirror holding up his own. A nearby customer coughed, and a few others glanced at her. Mrs. Grace stood tall, not small in stature, despite her age. Ethan tried to keep his voice calm, but his breathing was heavy. Ma'am, I just thought maybe you had the wrong date. You think so? She asked. Her voice unchanged. There was a moment of silence. Then Ethan said something the whole room would remember. Maybe you should try somewhere else. Here, we serve real customers with reservations. The sentence fell in the air, sharp as a knife. No one laughed. Even the sound of the spoon stopped. In the eyes of the people around, there was a mixture of discomfort and embarrassment. They did not dare to speak out, but everyone knew in their hearts a boundary had just been crossed. Grace stood still. No reaction, no argument. The light reflecting off her glasses obscured her eyes, but the way she held the strap of her bag lightly told you there was a wave rising inside her, and she was trying to keep it from breaking. She took a deep breath. Do you know what day it is? She asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Ethan shrugged. I don't know, and I don't care. There was a brief pause. She nodded, her lips pursed as if to contain a familiar pain. I see, she said. To you. I'm just an old, dark woman out of place. The air was heavy. Ethan wanted to protest, but her words were as light as smoke, and smoke was elusive. Mr. Collins stepped forward, his voice urgent. Ethan, you should apologize right now. Why Ethan responded, defending himself with youthful logic. I didn't do anything wrong. I just told the truth. Grace looked at him not with resentment, but with the weariness of someone who had seen too many similar scenes. You're right, she said softly. You've done nothing wrong. If the world still thinks respect is something that must be deserved. Ethan was silent, not because he understood, but because he didn't know how to defend himself against that voice, a voice that wasn't high-pitched, but made one feel small. A waitress walked by, put down her glass of water on a nearby table, and silently looked at Mrs. Grace. There was something else in her eyes, a realization. Perhaps she had just understood that the woman before them was more than just a customer. Mrs. Grace turned to Mr. Collins. Thank you for checking, but I think I'll go. Not because I don't have a table, but because today I don't want to eat in a place where people forget that kindness is served. Her voice remained calm, but each word seemed to leave a small cut in the air. Ethan stepped back. His foot hit the counter, knocking the menu over. It made a dull sound. No one picked it up. Mrs. Grace turned. Each step she took was slow and steady, not the steps of someone who had failed, but of someone who had given up at the right moment. But just as her hand touched the door, Mr. Collins spoke, his voice trembling. Grace, please don't go. The boss won't accept this. Her name startled several of the waiters. Ethan stood still, eyes wide. What? What did you say? Who are you? Mr. Collins looked at him, his eyes filled with anger and despair. It's the mother of Mr. David Thompson, the owner of this restaurant. The words swept through like a cold wind. Ethan was stunned. His lips moved, but no words came out. Grace turned back, her eyes strangely calm. Don't worry, she said. I'm not angry. You just said what you thought. Sometimes it's that honesty that makes people see themselves more clearly than ever. She smiled, not a victorious smile, but the smile of one who has seen through another's limitations. Then she turned away. The air in the Golden Spoon was so thick that all sound was swallowed up. Ethan stood stock still, while Mr. Collins bowed his head, his hands clasped, knowing the real storm was still behind him. Outside the restaurant, the late afternoon light reflected off the glass windows, reflecting Grace's placid face. But inside, the repercussions of a few careless words were beginning to ripple out, and it would reach someone Ethan never expected. Outside the restaurant, the early afternoon air had turned chilly. The last rays of sunlight fell on the glass windows of the Golden Spoon restaurant, reflecting on Grace Thompson, his face calm, but with a churning ocean in her eyes. She stood still for a long moment. From inside, the sounds of knives and forks, laughter and chatter blended together, blurring like echoes from another world, a world she had once believed she belonged to. The wind blew, carrying the scent of coffee and baked goods, familiar scents that had warmed her heart every time she visited. But today, the scent brought a lump to her throat. She didn't know if it was the scent of memory or pain. A young man opened the door and entered, bowing politely. She moved slightly to let him in, then smiled to herself. Politeness costs nothing, but sometimes people regret it the most. The whisper was as light as the wind, dispersing into the street. She left the glass door and walked slowly to the small stone bench in front of the restaurant. Sitting down, she gently stretched out her hands, clenching and unclenching them as if trying to calm the trembling in her palms. And then, the past image came flooding back so clearly that she could hear her own footsteps that year, in worn-out shoes, on the snowy street. Flashback, 1963, Montgomery, Alabama. A small roadside eatery, its signboard old. The words, whites only, faded with time. Grace was 20 years old that year, newly married to Richard Thompson, with a simple dream to serve a meal like everyone else. She walked in, sat down, and waited. A white waiter approached, his voice dry. Sorry, you know the rules. Grace smiled. I know, but rules can't be longer than dignity. Right. The man was silent, then turned away, leaving the menu slammed shut on the table. She sat for a moment, then stood up and left in silence. "Aren't you angry?" Richard asked her that day. She just shook her head. "Yes, I am. But if you let them be angry, they'll think they've won." Now, half a century has passed, and she still sits in the same position. Only the world around her has changed the paint, and the prejudice remains in the brickwork. She looked at her hands, fingers mottled with age, slightly trembling with age, but hands that had cooked hundreds of meals, taught dozens of waiters how to smile, and held her husband's hand when they first opened the golden spoon. She remembered that day clearly. Richard smiled and said, "See, we're going to make this place different. Here, everyone gets the same service." That promise now rang in her head like a distorted old song. Ethan didn't know it. When he said you should try somewhere else, he was tapping into the pain of not just one person, but an entire generation who had been forced to try somewhere else in every aspect of life, from restaurants to schools to human opportunity. Grace wasn't mad at him. Anger, to her, was a luxury only those who didn't understand the world well enough could afford. She just felt pity for the blindness of a young mind, and for the society that had nurtured such arrogance as the norm. A young woman stopped beside her, holding out a handkerchief. "Are you okay?" Grace smiled and took it, her voice soft. "I'm fine. It's just that sometimes people don't realize they're hurting others until they get hurt themselves." The girl nodded, then walked away, leaving her in a comfortable silence. She looked down at the handkerchief and noticed a small E embroidered on the edge. A letter that was unintentional, but reminded her of Ethan, the man who had insulted her a few minutes ago. She thought to herself, perhaps, when we were young, we were all Ethans. Deep down, she knew her patience was not weakness. It was a choice to stand still, to let justice unfold in the light of truth, not in the storm of emotion. An elderly woman walked by, stopped to look at her, and recognized her. "You are Grace Thompson." "Right, I remember you. You taught my daughter at the vocational training center back then." Grace nodded, smiling slightly. "I just helped her realize that she was good enough." The woman nodded. "She still talks about you." She said, "Grace taught me that dignity is something no one can take away." That statement made her pause. It was true. Dignity is something you carry within yourself. Dignity is not what others see. It is how you see yourself, even when others try to tear you down. She took a deep breath. The chill in her chest slowly dissipated. Inside, Mr. Colin's silhouette still flickered through the door. Perhaps he was confused, or scared, or trying to call David, but she didn't want to think about that anymore. She stood. Her steps were light but sure. The pain of being scorned was still there, but it no longer crushed her. It became a quiet strength, making her posture straighter, her eyes brighter. On the way back to the parking lot, she stopped. In that moment, two paths opened up, one to leave, as she had so many times chosen to remain silent in the face of injustice. Two, to return, not to retaliate, but to prove that silence can also make others listen. A small voice spoke in her mind, a voice as deep as Richard's. Sometimes grace, to teach people a lesson. You don't have to speak loudly. Just stand still and let them feel small. She smiled slightly. Then she turned her head. The Golden Spoon's glass doors opened again, revealing her reflection, a small, almost proud, silver-haired woman, walking back to the place that had hurt her. Not to claim justice for herself, but to remind the world that true justice does not need to be heard by shouting. And when she walks through that door again, The people inside will have no idea what they are about to witness: a woman returning not to demand rights, but to teach the room what dignity is. Grace Thompson stood in front of the Golden Spoon's glass doors for the second time that afternoon. The light reflected her silhouette, mingling with the last rays of late sunlight. There was something about her posture that slowed the street down, vulnerable and determined at the same time, as if she were saying to herself, "Not today." The door opened, and a small bell rang. No one paid any attention to her. No one noticed that the woman who had been refused service less than 10 minutes ago had now returned, looking as calm as if nothing had happened, no longer hurt, but the silence of someone who has seen a lifetime of injustice and chosen to face it with wisdom. She walked in, unhurried, her gaze sweeping the gleaming room. In the far corner, Ethan was talking to a colleague, his voice irritably strained, as if the incident were a stain he wanted to wipe off his workday. She didn't look at him, just chose an empty chair by the window, the same one she sat in every year on her birthday. Another waitress approached, and before she could even open her mouth, Ethan interrupted. "There's no need to wait on that table. I already told her. There's no table left." His voice was loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. "Mrs." Grace raised her head, her eyes calm, neither angry nor reproachful. "Just for a moment." Her lips curled up slightly, not a smile, but as if she had just made a decision in her heart. "She is not going. She will stay. If he leaves," she told herself, "he will never learn anything. Respect cannot be taught with words, but it can be taught with a mirror." And today, she chose to be that example. An elderly customer at the next table glanced over. Perhaps he recognized something familiar in that calm demeanor, the quiet dignity that only those who have endured many wounds can bear. She gently called the waitress from earlier. "Can I have a cup of black tea?" Her voice was soft and clear. Not a request, just a normal statement like any other customer. The girl hesitated, turned to look at Ethan. Ethan shook his head. "Not serving her. I told you." The sentence came out cold and decisive. Grace bent down slightly, picked up the tablecloth, and adjusted the fold. It was a small, simple action, but there was something about it that made the room pause. It was like when one is too calm in the face of absurdity. One begins to feel wrong. Ethan stepped closer, trying to regain the initiative. I think it's best if you leave. We have rules here." She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Rules?" she asked evenly. "Yes. Anyone not on the reservation list will not be served." "And you believe all lists are correct?" Ethan paused. The question wasn't just a rebuttal, but a needle piercing through his arrogance. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "the people who have no names are the ones who wrote the book you are reading." Ethan didn't understand the full meaning, but he sensed the weight in her voice. Something kept him from looking away, but his instinct to protect himself made him blurt out the familiar line. "Anyway, I was just doing my job." She nodded. "I know." Her eyes softened, as if she were seeing the 10-year-old boy inside him, the one who had never been taught that respecting others didn't make him any less of a person. In her mind, her late husband's voice echoed again. "Grace, sometimes pride is just a cloak to cover up the fear of being looked down on." She understood that Ethan wasn't really strong. He was just trying to prove that he had power, a small, temporary power. But to him, it was honor. And that's why she decided to stay. No one knew it, but all the while, she was silently observing every detail: the way the waiter waited on other tables, the way he changed his tone with each customer, the way Mr. Collins avoided her gaze as he walked by. Each behavior was a piece of a larger picture, a picture of how people treat each other when they think no one is looking. She knew that if she left, Ethan would never see the rest of the picture. If she stayed, justice would take its course. After a moment, she stood up and walked toward the bar. "Can you bring me a menu?" Her voice was still light, like the wind through the leaves. Ethan turned back. This time his eyes began to waver. "Didn't you hear me?" She tilted her head and smiled faintly. "I heard clearly. But hearing clearly doesn't mean I agree." The words, to Ethan, were like a jolt that knocked him off balance. Not because she challenged him, but because she showed no fear. Instead, she made him wonder. "What am I doing?" But before he could find an answer, "Mr. Collins stepped forward, his voice hurried. "Ethan, let me do it." He turned to Mrs. Grace with a forced smile. "Madam, perhaps we should go to the table. I have prepared a place for you." She looked at him and said slowly, "I will go in, but not because you invited me, but because I want to see how far one can go in not seeing oneself." Mr. Collins froze. It was unclear who she was talking to him, Ethan, or the room as a whole. She returned to the table and sat down. Outside, the fading afternoon light cast a soft shadow of her shadow on the glass window. Ethan took a few steps back, feeling something in his chest collapse, though he didn't quite understand what. In Grace's eyes, there was no longer any trace of anger, only calmness, the calmness of someone who had decided not to run away from pain, but to let it become a mirror for others to look at. And then, when she ordered her second cup of tea, no one in the restaurant knew that the real confrontation had just begun, a confrontation not of shouting, but of a silence that made all excuses redundant. The atmosphere in the Golden Spoon restaurant became strangely quiet. The sound of glasses hitting plates, knives and forks clanking against china, everything stopped for a few seconds, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Mrs. Grace Thompson sat still, her hands clasped lightly together, her eyes fixed on the window where the sunset reflected on the table. There was nothing remarkable about the action, but the very stillness made the room suffocatingly tense. Ethan approached, his voice stiff. "Madam, I think I've said enough. There are no empty tables here." Grace raised her head slowly. Her eyes were neither cold nor angry, only the weariness of someone who had seen too much of the same thing in her life. "Are you sure," she said softly, "that there is no place here for someone like me?" Ethan paused. He didn't understand why his heart was pounding so hard. Maybe it was because the question, though gentle, sounded like an accusation. A few customers at a nearby table looked up. A middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "She did nothing wrong." The husband glanced around and shook his head. "Don't interfere. It's not worth the trouble." That unworthiness, as usual, is what allows injustice to persist for so long. Ethan tried to regain his composure, replying in a more contemptuous tone, "Ma'am, I told you, there's nothing for you here." His voice dragged out the word madam, no longer a title, but a hidden stab. The air around them thickened, as if someone had just turned the temperature down a few degrees. Grace didn't respond right away. She slowly picked up the glass of water in front of her, brought it to her lips, and then set it down. It seemed meaningless, but it made Ethan feel like he was being watched. "You know," she said, her voice so low that only people close by could hear it. "Sometimes people don't realize how small they are until they try to make someone else look smaller." Ethan clenched his fists. He wanted to respond, but for some reason his throat tightened. He looked around, hoping for some sympathetic look, but there were none. Everyone kept their heads down, as if they were in a classroom and didn't want to be called on. Grace twisted the ring on her finger, the light glinting off the table. "Do you have a manager here?" Her voice was even. "Yes," Ethan said, "but he's busy. And in fact, he would tell you the same thing." "Really?" She tilted her head. "Well," Ethan said, trying to regain control, "we have rules. We can't accommodate everyone, especially those who don't fit in with the vibe here." The two words inappropriate fell, sounding drier than the sound of cutlery. A white customer at the next table let out a soft sigh, loud enough for the person sitting next to him to hear inappropriate. "She just wants to have dinner." The person next to him replied softly, "That boy is digging his own grave." Ethan didn't hear, or pretended not to hear. He crossed his arms, stood up straight, and smiled faintly. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. You don't need to make a big deal out of it." Grace nodded, her lips moving slightly as if talking to herself. "People always say, just doing their job before hurting someone." Then she looked up, her voice clearer. "I want to see the manager." The words were not loud, but enough for the whole area to hear. Ethan smiled faintly and shook his head. "There is nothing here for you. Trust me." There was a long silence. No one laughed. No one spoke. Even the background music of the restaurant was drowned out by the heartbeats of the onlookers. Grace sat still, her eyes fixed on Ethan, as if she were looking through his mask of confidence to see a young soul bound by prejudices he didn't even know he believed. "You know what the worst part about this treatment is?" Ethan frowned. "I'm not in the mood for a sermon." "Not sermon," she replied. "It's experience. I've seen people like you thinking they're above everyone else, until they realize they're just standing in the shadow of their own arrogance." The words made Ethan blush. He was about to step forward, to react. But at that moment, Mr. Collins' voice rang out from the counter. "Ethan, what's wrong?" All eyes immediately turned towards them. Ethan swallowed and took half a step back. "It's nothing. I was just dealing with a inappropriate customer. Mr. Collins approached, his face showing signs of fatigue. But when his eyes fell on Mrs. Grace, he paused. A flash of shock passed through him. He recognized her at once. "Oh, my God," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Ethan, not understanding, still tried to defend his point of view. "I told you she wasn't on the reservation list." "I just shut up, Mr. Collins interrupted. The room fell silent. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. He had never heard the manager speak so loudly before. "Mr. Collins swallowed, then turned to Mrs. Grace, bowing deeply. "Madam, please forgive me. I didn't know." But Grace held up a hand, stopping her. "You don't have to explain," she said softly. Then she turned to Ethan, her voice steady. "You're right. There's nothing here for me. But maybe there's nothing here for you either." Ethan looked at her, confused, not understanding what she meant. But in that calm look, he knew the undertow was starting to rise, and when it hit, he would have no place to hold on to. The room fell into an eerie silence. No one spoke, but everyone understood. This was no longer a story about a meal, but a confrontation between two worlds, one of arrogant prejudice, the other of unyielding dignity. When Ethan ducked his head to avoid her gaze, Mr. Collins quickly turned away to hide his fear. But in that moment, Grace's eyes were drawn to a place beyond where old memories resurfaced, reopening wounds she thought had lain dormant for half a century. The room was so quiet you could hear the gasp of time itself. The light from the bar fell on the tiled floor, reflecting the silhouette of Grace Thompson, small, but as solid as a statue carved from suffering. Ethan stood there, awkwardly silent, unsure of what to say. Grace, on the other hand, closed her eyes as if to see more clearly what was stirring inside. A faint echo from the past rang out. It was unclear whether the sound was real or just in memory, but it came so clearly that she could smell it, the smell of old wood paint, sweat, and cheap pastries from that year's Johnson's Deli. Flashback, Birmingham, 1965. Grace Johnson was 19 years old at the time. It was a hot summer in the southern United States. She walked into a small grocery store, crumpled bills in hand, wanting to buy a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk for her mother. The white shopkeeper looked at her, his eyes cold and suspicious. "We don't sell to people like you here." The words were as calm as a rule, not hateful, but colder than hate. Grace looked around and saw several other customers bowing their heads, pretending not to hear. She didn't argue, just asked softly, "Why does my money have no value?" The man shrugged. "It's not the money. It's the person holding the money." She stood there, surrounded by the creaking ceiling fan and the disdainful gaze. Then she turned away, not angry, not crying. But from that day on, she understood that there were places where one did not need to close the door to keep someone from entering. Now, half a century later, Grace could still hear that voice echoing in her memory. The words never died. They just lay dormant, waiting for someone to wake them. And today, Ethan's voice did just that. She opened her eyes. The present room and the past memory seemed to merge two spaces. One feeling. The contempt was the same color. Only now it was hidden behind a formal uniform and a professional voice. Ethan still has no idea he's repeating the history she lived through. She looked at him not with anger, but with pity. Perhaps, had he been born in her generation, he would have been treated the same way. And that was the real tragedy. Injustice is transmitted not only through the blood of the victim, but also through the habits of the perpetrator. She gently smoothed the edge of her dress with her hand, an old habit she had when she wanted to maintain her composure. The small action, to outsiders, was nothing remarkable, but to her, it marked the line between reaction and reflection, between the instinct to fight back and the choice to preserve her dignity. Inside the bar, Mr. Collins stood still, as if wrestling with his own conscience. He knew who Grace was, but lacked the courage to intervene. Ethan, after being interrupted, tried to salvage some of his confidence by maintaining an arrogant posture, not realizing that he was slowly being swallowed by the silence of the woman before him. Grace took a deep breath and said slowly, "You know, Ethan, when I was young, someone kicked me out of a store because I wasn't like them. I thought I'd forgotten that feeling, but it never went away. It just stood there, waiting for someone to remind me." Ethan didn't reply, but his eyes wavered. She continued, her voice low, but each word sharp as a knife. "It's strange that someone as young as you is speaking the same language those people used to humiliate me back then." No one said anything. A female employee standing nearby bowed her head slightly, tears welling up in her eyes, not out of pity, but out of shame. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The past and present overlapped, blurred like images in a mirror of water. Grace no longer saw herself as a victim of the past, but as a witness to an unfinished circle. She realized if she left today, the circle would close exactly as it was, and the world would not change at all. But if she stayed, just by standing still, just by looking calmly, she could break it. She turned to Mr. Collins. "You don't need to defend me. Every person in this room is being taught the same lesson, a lesson I learned with tears, and they learned with silence." Then she stood up, saying nothing more. The air around her seemed thick. Ethan dared not look up. And in that split second, Mr. Collins understood this was not just a matter of customer versus employee. It was a test of the conscience of everyone present. Grace took a deep breath and closed her eyes. A breeze blew through the window, carrying the smell of coffee and the sound of footsteps outside. In her mind, the image of the young girl from years ago gradually faded, replaced by the woman she was now, hair gray, but eyes brighter than ever. She is no longer a victim. She is a mirror for the past to see the present, and the present to see the past. She took a deep breath, her hands falling to her sides. When she opened her eyes, everything inside her was calm. And in that moment, her calmness became the most powerful weapon in that stuffy room. Grace Thompson opened her eyes. Everything was the same white ceiling light, the faint smell of coffee, the occasional clatter of cutlery. But inside her, something was different. There was no more pain of memory, no more anger. There was only an absolute stillness, a stillness that no one could understand except those who had learned to stand still in the storm without breaking. Ethan looked at her, the forced smile gone, replaced by confusion mixed with anger. He couldn't bear the feeling of losing without knowing why. In his head, a familiar voice rang out, "Don't give them a chance to overwhelm you. You have to be strong." And so he raised his voice, trying to regain the initiative. "Didn't you hear me? I told you. You're not on the list. I can't serve people who—" He hesitated. The words stuck in his throat, for there was something in her eyes that made him ashamed to say them. Grace didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes hidden behind her glasses, mirroring Ethan's reflection, distorted, awkward, like the self-doubt rising inside him. A few diners began to notice. A soft murmur rose, like a wind whistling through the rows of seats. "What is he doing? How embarrassing!" Ethan listened, but the more he listened, the angrier he became. His anger wasn't so much for Grace, but for himself, for the feeling that power was slipping away. He tapped his hand lightly on the counter, trying to maintain control. "Ma'am, I've made it clear. There's nothing for you here. Please leave, or I'll call security." The words fell, sharp and cold. A couple at a nearby table paused, the husband about to speak, but the wife placed a hand on his shoulder and shook her head slightly. They knew this was no longer a matter between customer and employee. It was a test of human character. "Mrs." Grace sat still. There was no sign of fear, no resistance, no confusion. Just one sentence, as light as a breeze, "I will wait for the manager." Her voice was not high, but it carried so clearly that it filled the room. There was no command in it, no pleading, just the absolute certainty of someone who knew she was on the right side. Ethan curled his lips, half smiling, half disdainful. "Wait, do you think he can do anything for you?" She kept her eyes steady. "He may not be able to do anything," she said, "but I will wait, because I believe the truth will always find someone to listen." The words made the air freeze. A waitress standing near the counter ducked down, avoiding Ethan's gaze, and quietly walked toward the back of the kitchen. Though no one said it, everyone knew something bigger was about to happen. Ethan crossed his arms, trying to appear confident. but his shoulders were shaking slightly. Not because he was afraid of her, but because he was afraid of the eyes around him, who were slowly realizing who he was in this story. The camera, if it had one, would have lingered on Grace's face. It was as still as a lake, but in the reflected light, one could see the marks of time, each wrinkle like a scar, from years of struggle, endurance, and forgiveness. It was not the face of a victim, but of someone who had learned to win through silence. A child sitting with his parents at a nearby table turned and asked quietly, "Daddy." "Why doesn't she talk back?" the father replied in a low voice. "Because sometimes, son, silence is the way to make others listen." Ethan was annoyed, speaking louder, as if to suppress the atmosphere that was leaning towards her. "Do you hear me? I said leave, Mrs." Grace let out a soft breath, still looking at him, her voice soft. "You are trying to embarrass me in front of everyone. But you know, I am not the one who is embarrassed right now." A wave of silence swept through the room. Another employee dropped a tray, the crash echoing like a note in a song without words. Someone at a corner table whispered, "God, she's strong." Ethan turned away, avoiding her gaze, but the act itself made him look smaller. Grace said nothing more. She just sat there as if she were waiting, as she put it, not waiting for someone, but for justice to come of its own accord. It is said that anger is fire and calmness is water. But when water is deep enough, it can put out any fire, no smoke, no sound. And in that moment, the viewer felt it clearly. Grace's silence was no longer endurance, but a silent declaration of dignity. "Mr. Collins appeared in the distance, hurrying out from the kitchen counter. Ethan saw this and breathed a sigh of relief. He thought he would be on his side, would get this over with. But when the manager approached and his eyes fell on Mrs. Grace's face, his expression changed. No one knew what it meant, but it was clear the order in this room was about to be reversed. When Mr. Collins's eyes met Mrs. Grace's, the air in the room froze. Ethan didn't know what was happening, and Mrs. Grace just nodded, the quiet smile of someone who knew that justice was finally coming, slowly but surely. "Mr. Collins's boots echoed steadily on the wooden floor, cutting through the thick silence of the restaurant. He had just emerged from the kitchen, adjusting his tie, his face showing the fatigue of a long day. In his mind, this was probably just a minor complaint some difficult customer, or an inexperienced employee who had let something slip. He exhaled and told himself, just deal with it quickly, apologize a few times, give away free dessert, and that's it. Little did he know, in just a few seconds, his world would change. Mrs. Grace Thompson remained seated, still as a rock in the water. Ethan, standing next to her, was beginning to lose his composure, sweat seeping through his collar, his eyes wavering between confidence and confusion. "What's going on here, Mr.?" Collins' voice rang out. Not loud, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Ethan quickly walked over and pointed at Mrs. Grace. "Nothing. I'm just dealing with a guest who doesn't listen to the rules." "Sir." Mr. Collins nodded, out of habit. But when his eyes left Ethan and turned to the woman sitting at the table, he froze. In that moment, if there had been a camera, it would have lingered on his face, eyes wide open, then a slight startle, followed by panic spreading like a wave. His mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, but no words came out. He took a half step back, took a deep breath, and then whispered, "Ms., Mrs., Grace, Mrs." Grace looked up, smiling slightly, not blaming, nor showing any sign of victory. Just a small nod, enough to confirm, "Yes, it is me." Everything seemed to stop moving. Ethan looked from one to the other, confused. "You know her?" he asked, his voice still firm, but his hands were shaking. "Mr.?" Collins swallowed, turned to him, his eyes wide as if to tell him to stop. But Ethan wouldn't listen. He continued, his voice rising, a little angry. "She's making a fuss because there's no table. I made it clear, Ethan, Mr.—" Collins interrupted, his voice so stern that the room fell silent. Do you know who she is?" Ethan frowned, annoyed. "Just a customer. Who else?" "Mr.—" Collins clenched his fists, trying to stay calm, then spoke each word slowly and clearly, like a verdict. "Mrs. Grace is the mother of David Thompson, the owner of this restaurant." Silence filled the air. The only sound was the clock on the wall, ticking in the dead room. Ethan stood frozen, his lips moving, but no words came out. The color drained from his face, as if the blood had been sucked from his body. Several guests let out a soft sigh. A man shook his head and said softly, "Oh, my God." What did he do? Grace remained seated, her gaze unchanging, not happy, not pleased. She simply observed calmly, as if this matter no longer concerned her honor, but to others, that calmness was the most silent court. "Mr. Collins bowed his head deeply. "Madam, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't— Mrs. Grace raised her hand slightly to stop him. "No need. Mr. Collins, I'm just a guest, like everyone else." Her voice was warm, but there was something in it that sent a chill down Mr. Collins's spine. For the very way she said a guest like any other suggested the most ironic thing. She was clearly not being treated like one. Ethan bowed his head, not daring to look. He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse. I don't know. I don't—" Grace didn't interrupt, just looked at him. The look wasn't harsh, not contemptuous, just sad. Sad for a generation that had forgotten that respect doesn't have to be taught, just observed. The atmosphere in the restaurant became tense. A few customers began to leave their seats, not out of curiosity, but out of embarrassment for the young waiter. "Mr. Collins kept his head down, his voice low. "Grace, I'm truly sorry. If Sir David finds out about this—" "No," she interrupted. "You don't need to tell him. I will." She stood up, adjusted her coat, and walked slowly but steadily, as if each step carried the weight of history, a history that didn't need to be shouted, just seen. Ethan watched, genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing his job, but fear of becoming the image of the people he had hated hearing about in history. "Mr. Collins put his hand on his shoulder and said in a low, trembling voice, "Ethan, you have insulted your paymaster's mother, but I don't know, nobody knows," he said. "And that's the trouble. One only feels remorse when one has forgotten how to be a man." Grace paused at the door. She didn't turn around, didn't say another word. There was a long silence, a silence that made everyone examine themselves. A few guests quietly stood up, placing their hands on their hearts in silent apology. Slow motion. The restaurant door opens. A gentle breeze blows in. The light from outside spills over her shoulders, casting a thin halo over her silver hair. The image, a woman of color, walking away from a place that once rejected her, becomes a symbol of justice that doesn't need to scream, just silence. Outside, the afternoon light was turning golden. In that space, a luxury car stopped, and from inside stepped a young man, David Thompson, Grace's son. Little did he know that, in a few minutes, he would have to face the greatest lesson his mother had left him. Justice does not always come from power, but from how we face wrong. The restaurant was still thick, as if no one dared to breathe. The light from the ceiling shone down, reflecting the shadows of three people, Mrs. Grace, Ethan, and Mr. Collins, standing between two worlds, one of truth, the other of fear. Mr. Collins bowed, his voice trembling slightly, trying to regain the familiar control of a manager. Madam Grace, perhaps there has been a slight mistake in the procedure. Please return to your table. We will prepare the best seats immediately. His voice was a mixture of respect and calculation, apology and fear of losing his job. He didn't look at her, but looked around as if afraid that the diners were filming, afraid that this little incident would become the subject of an online storm. Mrs. Grace was silent for a few seconds, her eyes soft but deep. Then she spoke softly, slowly, word by word. You don't need to set the table for me. The words, as light as a breath, made Mr. Collins stop. Ethan was still standing there, his heart pounding, sweat beading on his forehead. He glanced at the manager as if waiting for a distress signal, but Collins didn't reply, just forced a smile. His voice lowered. Madam, we're truly sorry. It won't happen again. If you'll excuse me, I'll personally serve dinner tonight. Mrs. Grace kept her voice even, her eyes unchanging. Mr. Collins, she interrupted, do you think I need a seat? No one answered. Her question echoed in the empty space. Like a gentle knock on the door of conscience, a few of the guests held their breath and looked over. They didn't understand everything, but they sensed something bigger was going on, something beyond the scope of an apology. Grace gently placed her hand on the empty table beside her, her voice low but firm. I don't need a table. I can eat anywhere. But there is one thing that no place can serve without respect. Ethan looked up, his mouth open, but no words came out. Mr. Collins' face turned red, then pale. He was about to say something, but she spoke again, softly, almost in a whisper. This isn't about a reservation. It's about respect. The room was dead silent. No more cutting of knives or talking. Just the faint sound of the air conditioner blowing through like a cold breeze. Everyone heard every word, even though she didn't raise her voice. And it was that calmness, not anger, that shook everyone. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. Mr. Collins bowed his head, his voice breaking. I understand, ma'am. I am ashamed of what has happened. But everyone knew he did not really understand. What he feared was not the mistake, but the consequences of the mistake. Ethan, still not entirely convinced, muttered, Your son is the owner of this restaurant. She did not answer. She only smiled slightly, a smile that neither confirmed nor denied. The smile of someone who was old enough not to need words to prove her authority. Something inside her broke not anger, but pity. Not for herself, but for the younger generation, like Ethan, for those who thought themselves above others simply because they were in a position of service. They, she knew, were victims of the same twisted system, one where people were taught to discriminate rather than understand. She stood. The chair creaked slightly, but it drew all eyes to her. No one in the room knew what she would do next. Mr. Collins stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly, his voice pleading. Mrs. Grace, please give us a chance to make things right. I will. She held up a hand to stop him. No. Mr. Collins. I don't need that opportunity. I just need you to remember, no one loses their job for apologizing, but many lose their dignity for not knowing when to stop and listen. The words fell like a thin, bloodless cut, but everyone felt the wound. Ethan bowed his head, not daring to look up. Collins, his hands hanging limply, his eyes unfocused. He understood any excuses now would only make him smaller. An elderly customer sitting near the door shook his head slightly. That woman has something really strong. She doesn't need to shout, but still makes the whole room bow their heads. The imaginary camera pans slowly over Grace's face. A slight smile, hidden behind deep, calm eyes. There is no hatred in those eyes, only the weariness of someone who has seen too much and still chooses to forgive, even though the world has not changed. Mr. Collins turned slightly, signaling Ethan to go inside, but as he was about to leave, Mrs. Grace spoke softly. "Young man." Ethan turned back. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "Someday, when you serve someone who doesn't look like you, remember they may be the one to show you your true worth." Ethan didn't answer, just nodded. A tear, from regret or shame, rolled down his cheek. Grace nodded slightly and returned to her seat. She no longer needed the table, or the food, or the waiting. Just the silence that had been restored, not silence from fear, but from having said enough. As she sat down, several diners pulled out their phones. One whispered, "Someone should record this." And within minutes, Grace's moment of silence had spread throughout the room like a small spark waiting to ignite in the world. The air in the Golden Spoon restaurant began to stir. At first, it was just a few discreet glances. Then, slowly, phones were pulled out. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew they were witnessing something bigger than a dispute over seating. A young customer put his phone on the table and secretly filmed through a glass of clear water. A middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "See, the way she stands there, as if the world couldn't make her bow her head." The husband nodded slightly, his eyes resting on Grace Thompson. His calm face. "There are people," he said slowly, "who can make others think just by standing still." Mr. Collins glanced around, a wry smile on his face. He knew his attempts to control the situation were now meaningless. When the little LED lights on the phone started flashing, he understood this story was no longer theirs. He lowered his voice and said to a nearby employee, "Stop filming. Someone, tell them to respect the customers." But no one moved. A young waitress whispered, "We can't stop them, sir. They're just filming." The truth, Ethan, still standing nearby, avoided everyone's gaze. His collar was soaked with sweat, his hands shaking as he gripped the serving towel. Every time the camera clicked, he felt like someone slapped him in the face, not from fear, but from the realization that he had become the image of what he once considered outdated and shameful. An elderly white man stood up and approached Mrs. Grace. His voice was shaky, but sincere. "Madam, I want to say, I apologize on behalf of those of us who have been too afraid to speak up for so long." She turned around and smiled slightly. Not a forgiving smile, but the smile of someone who understands that the awakening of conscience is never too late, as long as it comes from the heart. In the dim light, her face was clearly visible. Silver hair, deep eyes, soft but determined features. She did not shy away from the camera. Instead, she stood straight, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair, as if she were witness to something no one else dared to say. Justice does not need to be acted out. It just needs to be seen. Every glance, every pan, lingered on her the woman who didn't need to scream, didn't need to blame, just needed to stand still in the truth. Mr. Collins tried to calm down, walked towards a group of guests nearby, and said in a low voice, "Please do not post any footage. This is just a small misunderstanding." But the more he spoke, the more attention he attracted. One of the guests replied, not angrily, but sadly, "No, Mr. Collins. Small things don't need to be turned around, but this needs to be seen." He stood frozen, the words soft, but sharper than any public rebuke. A soft ding sounded from the corner of the room. A video had just been posted online. The title text appeared on someone's phone screen. Elderly black woman, humiliated at the Golden Spoon restaurant. Within minutes, the people in the bar began to take notice. A wave of silence spread like a cold wind. They realized they were no longer just witnesses, but had become a part of this story. A young woman, the cashier, looked up from the counter, her eyes worried. "Sir, that post has been shared hundreds of times." Mr. Collins was startled, holding his forehead. He whispered, "Oh my God, if David knew about this." But Mrs. Grace, hearing, remained calm. "You need not worry about me," she said. "Let the world see what it needs to see." Her words did not sound like a challenge, but rather a gentle judgment for the truth, once exposed, needs no protection. Ethan turned to look at her, for once without any hint of arrogance. He started to say something, but stopped. Instead, he just said quietly, almost to himself, "Maybe I deserve to be turned back." She didn't answer. Her eyes, deep and calm, looked through him as if at a generation that needed to relearn. An old lesson: dignity doesn't come from skin color or position, but from how you treat others. Outside, the afternoon light was slanting, reflecting through the glass. Grace's shadow stretched across the floor, merging with the light like a living portrait of silent justice. The whole restaurant was strangely quiet. No one spoke, no one dared to smile. The silence was no longer an avoidance, but a confirmation that they had seen something true, and could no longer pretend they had not seen it. Mr. Collins stepped back and sighed. All the management skills, all the service principles, all the crisis procedures he had ever learned, they were now useless. For before him was no longer a customer, but a moral mirror that reflected the entire system. Grace didn't need to say anything more. The story told itself. In another part of town, in an office on the 25th floor, David Thompson, Grace's son, had just received a text message from a friend, David. "Have you seen this video?" The phone screen lit up, and in the light, his eyes widened. The moment he recognized the woman in the clip as his mother, and the moment justice began to find its way back. The afternoon in David Thompson's office passed as usual. Soft yellow light from the large windows fell on a desk covered with papers, interior design drawings for the expansion of the Golden Spoon chain. David, dressed in a casual suit, removed his tie and leaned back in his chair, intending to take a few minutes off work after a long meeting. A soft ding sound came from his phone. A text message. The sender was Mark, his best friend and media advisor. "David, have you seen this video link attached? Elderly black woman humiliated at the Golden Spoon?" At first, David just frowned, the reflex of a manager who was used to online drama. He thought this was a small misunderstanding, like many before. But then, something compelled him to click open. The first image that appeared, the yellow lights in the restaurant, the whispers of customers, and A tall silver-haired woman standing in the middle of that space, not angry, not noisy, just eerily calm. David tilted his head, his heart beating a little faster. There was something familiar about that pose. He zoomed in. The woman looked up slightly, and for a second, his world fell apart. That's his mother, Grace Thompson. No, it can't be, David whispered. His voice choked. His hands shook, the phone almost falling from his grasp. He rewound the clip, eyes unblinking, trying to convince himself that he was wrong. But no, every gesture, every expression, every wrinkle at the corner of her eyes, it was all his mother. She was in his own restaurant, being treated like a stranger, or worse. A voice rang out from the video, Ethan's voice. "There's nothing for you here." Then her voice, soft but decisive. "This isn't about a reservation. It's about respect." David clenched his fists. Those words, he had heard them from his mother when he was little, when she taught him to respect everyone, no matter who they were. Those words, now ringing in the silent room, made his heart clench. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back, making a loud crash. The staff outside looked in, startled, but David said nothing. He walked quickly to the window, looking down at the street below where the cars were passing calmly, indifferent to everyone's personal pain. Hundreds of questions were running through his mind. Why did his mother go there? Why did no one recognize her? And why did the place he built become the place that brought humiliation to his mother? He bit his lip, trying to contain the anger rising in him. But it wasn't pure anger anymore. It was pain mixed with shame, as if he had betrayed the woman who had taught him compassion. A staff member knocked lightly on the door. "Sir, are you okay?" David didn't turn around. He just said softly, his voice hoarse, "Ready the car. Now." He picked up his phone and played the video again. But this time he didn't watch. He listened. He heard the noise, the clattering of chairs and tables, the whispers, and in it, his mother's silence. A silence that held everything words couldn't express: dignity, hurt, and strength. He thought back to his childhood, the days when his mother worked 2 jobs to put him through school. The evenings when she came home with chapped hands, but still smiling. She used to say, "You can lose money, lose reputation, but never lose respect for others. Because when you lose that, you have nothing left." And now, in the restaurant, she once suggested, the Golden Spoon people have forgotten that lesson. David walked quickly out of the office, his shoes clicking loudly on the stone floor. Each step seemed to be filled with years of pent-up anger, anger at society's prejudice, anger at the people he trusted betraying the values he built, and anger that his mother, the person he respected the most, was left alone amid the contempt of others. The assistant ran after him. "David, what's wrong? Where are you going?" He didn't stop, just threw back a short sentence. "To the restaurant." His voice was so cold that the whole hallway seemed to freeze. The car sped down the highway. David sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. The city lights reflected off him, cutting his face into patches of light and shadow, just like the emotions in his heart, half the pain of a son, the other half the determination of a master to seek justice. He turned on his phone again. The video had been shared thousands of times, with hundreds of angry comments. The word "justice for Grace" began to appear. He smiled slightly, an unhappy smile. Justice was being called. But what good was justice if the person who had done the harm was one of his own employees? The car stopped in front of the Golden Spoon. The sky had turned to dusk, the last light of the day illuminating the shiny sign like a paradox, a place once built on the belief in equality and respect, now the epicenter of prejudice and shame. David opened the car door and stepped out. The afternoon wind blew gently, carrying with it the whispers of the crowd gathered outside. He raised his head to look at the large mirror that reflected himself, and in his eyes, a silent oath formed. No one, no matter who, is allowed to make my mother bow her head in the place that bears the name of her family. He pushed the door open and entered. No warning, no greeting, just the sound of his boots echoing in the heavy air, signaling the approaching storm of justice. Inside, no one knew that the man who had just walked through the door was the real owner of the restaurant. And when his eyes stopped on Ethan's face, the air in the room froze. Only the truth remained, naked and inescapable. The glass doors of the Golden Spoon restaurant swung open, echoing softly in the dense atmosphere. Everyone in the restaurant turned. Street light flooded in, illuminating the figure of a man in a dark suit. David Thompson, the restaurant's owner and Grace's son. No one said anything. The room was so quiet you could hear your own heart beating. Ethan stood near the reception desk, his lips dry, his face pale. He didn't know who the man was, but the look in his eyes, a look that held a quiet power and a rising anger, made him take a step back. Grace stood still, a small monument amid the bewildered gazes. She did not turn around. She knew the footsteps. She knew it was her son. David walked straight to the center of the restaurant. There was no voice, no smile. Each step he took made the wooden floorboards echo heavily, each one, like a drumbeat pounding on the consciences of all who witnessed it. He stopped, just a few steps away from Ethan. His voice was low, cold as steel. "Who are Ethan?" Ethan swallowed, his voice trembling. Yep, sir." David interrupted, not shouting, not raising his voice, but each word was as hard as a knife. "You're fired. Get out of my restaurant." The air seemed to explode in silence. Ethan froze, his mouth moving without making a sound. He looked around, hoping for a look of help, but saw only faces bent down, avoiding his. "Mr. Collins hurried forward, trying to interject David. I can explain. This is a misunderstanding." David turned around, looked straight at him, his voice still calm but firm. "I trusted you, Collins. I trusted you to protect the values of this place, respect, kindness, dignity, and you failed. Mr. Collins opened his mouth, but then stood still, as if he had just been sentenced. No amount of excuses could save the day when the injured party was the restaurant owner's own mother. Only then did Mrs. Grace turn back. Her eyes were gentle, but there was a wave of emotion hidden within them. She did not stop him, nor did she gloat. She just silently looked at her son, who was standing between two worlds, responsibility and filial piety. David looked at his mother, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, Mom. I never thought this place would hurt you so much." She just shook her head, smiling wearily. "Not you, David. Just a lesson for all of us." Ethan bowed his head, his hands clenched. He spoke softly, trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." David turned, his gaze no longer angry, but deeply disappointed. Ignorance is no excuse for insulting someone. You don't have to know who they are to treat them with respect. The words rang out clearly, sending shivers down the spines of many of the customers in the restaurant. A few nodded slightly. An elderly woman whispered, "Yes. That's exactly what the world is missing." David turned and looked straight at Mr. Collins. "You've been here long enough to know what my philosophy is. It's not just about serving food, it's about serving people. If you don't understand that, then maybe the Golden Spoon isn't the place for you. Collins bowed his head. Tears fell from his eyes. Not because he feared losing his job, but because he knew he had lost something more important, his faith. "David, you're right," he whispered. "I forgot that this restaurant was built not just with your mother's money, but with her heart." Grace approached and gently placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "You did the right thing, son," she whispered. "But don't let justice be just punishment. Let it be a lesson." David was silent. The words were like cool water flowing through the fire burning inside him. He understood that, while the world was applauding revenge, his mother had chosen to forgive not because she was weak, but because she knew forgiveness is the true strength of the one who has won. He looked at Ethan one last time. His voice was low, but softer. "You should leave, but before you go, remember you weren't fired for a service error, but for forgetting that every human being deserves respect, no matter who they are." Ethan bowed his head and walked in silence. No one stopped him. The door closed behind him, leaving behind an atmosphere both heavy and light, like the air after a long rain. David turned back to his mother. "I'm going to close the restaurant for a while. Mom, everything needs to be redone. From the way we serve to the way we look at each other." Grace smiled softly, taking his hand. "There's no need to close the door. David, sometimes, to change people, you don't have to tear down a place, just change the hearts of the people who live there." Mother and daughter's eyes met, and in that moment, the audience felt justice had come, but not in the form of revenge, but of awakening. The frame freezes. Grace stands beside her son. In the warm light of the sunset streaming in through the window, there is no longer anger in their eyes, only faith that today's wounds will become tomorrow's lessons. After Ethan left, no one in the restaurant said a word. A few staff members stood silently, their eyes red. And when Grace said softly, "Bring me a cup of tea," like always, the room erupted. Her forgiveness was the finale no one expected, but everyone needed. The air in the Golden Spoon restaurant seemed to stagnate as the door closed behind Ethan. A light breeze from the ventilation system wafted through, carrying the scent of coffee, wood, and the strange feeling of a place that had just experienced something great. No one spoke. There was only the sound of breathing, the soft clink of knives and forks on plates, then stopping. In the middle of the room, Grace and David Thompson stood face to face. No more anger, no more judgmental looks, just two people, a mother and a son, standing amid brokenness that had been mended with courage and love. David walked slowly over, his eyes brimming with tears. He opened his mouth, but had to swallow several times before he could speak. His voice was hoarse, as if caught in his throat. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words were not loud, but when they rang out, they seemed to awaken the entire space, causing many people in the restaurant to bow their heads. It was not just the apology of a son, but of a generation, of an entire system that had been silent in the face of injustice, but now knew how to bow before the truth. "Mrs." Grace looked at her son and smiled slightly. The afternoon light filtered through the window and shone on her face, making the wrinkles appear brighter. She spoke slowly, each word soft but firm. "You did the right thing." Her voice had no pride, no sadness, only the acceptance and peace of someone who had gone through ups and downs and still kept faith in humanity. The atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly changed. A customer in the far corner clapped his hands softly, not loudly. Just a small clap, but it echoed in the silence. Then another, and another. In a moment, the whole restaurant was clapping, not for David, not for Grace, but for what they had all witnessed. Justice can come silently and still touch the heart. Mr. Collins bowed his head deeply. A tear fell to the floor. It was perhaps the first time he felt the meaning of the word respect, which he had long considered nothing more than a slogan hanging on the restaurant wall. The camera in the audience's head seemed to stop at that moment. A woman of color, silver hair, gentle smile, standing next to her son in the warm golden light of the afternoon. Behind them, the sign, the golden spoon, glittered. As a reminder, true luxury is not in where you sit, but in how you treat others. David bowed his head, took his mother's hand, and whispered, "I promise I won't let this place forget the values you taught me. The Golden Spoon won't just be a restaurant, it will be a promise." Grace took his hand and said softly, "You don't have to promise, David. Just live up to it." The scene slowed down. The last rays of sunlight reflected through the glass windows, spread across the wooden floor, and touched the faces of the still-standing diners. A middle-aged man whispered to his wife, "I think I just saw what I've been waiting to see. All my life, justice is not based on force, but on kindness." The woman replied, still looking at Grace. "Yes," she said. "She reminded me that sometimes just standing still can change people." No one was holding their phones anymore. No need. Everyone in the restaurant had already recorded that moment in their minds. Justice didn't need to be posted, didn't need a hashtag. It existed in a sympathetic look, in a hand held, in the smile of a mother knowing her son had grown up not in his career, but in his character. When the applause finally died down, David softly said to everyone, "Thank you. Today, we not only served food, but also learned a lesson in kindness. I hope, when you leave here, each of you will take a little bit of that lesson with you." Mrs. Grace looked around, her eyes gentle, then nodded slightly. No speech, no declaration, just by her presence. People understood morality is not something to be preached, but something to be lived. As the mother and daughter sat down, a young waitress who had been silently watching the whole thing approached them, trembling as she asked, "Madam, what would you like to have, Mrs.?" Grace looked at her, giving a forgiving smile. "The usual, girl. A cup of tea. No sugar." The whole room laughed softly, not with joy, but with relief after the storm. Something changed on everyone's faces. They looked at each other differently, spoke more softly, and smiled more genuinely. Outside, dusk had fallen. The restaurant's light cast a warm glow across the street, spreading far and wide among the passing people. Little did anyone know that from this small place, a lesson in courage and kindness was about to spread across the country, starting with a small video and ending with a big smile. That night, the video of elderly woman humiliated at the Golden Spoon went viral. But what stopped people in their tracks wasn't the fight. It was the moment Grace smiled and said, "You did the right thing." And so, their story no longer stayed within the four walls of the restaurant. It became a lesson for the world. That night, the city was lit up as usual. But among the millions of lights, there was another light coming from the phone screens, where the video elderly black woman humiliated at the Golden Spoon was being shared at an incredible speed. Within hours, tens of thousands of views, then hundreds of thousands. The comments began to pour in, quietly, but thickly and emotionally. One person wrote, "I don't know who she is. But the way she stood there calm, composed, made me feel ashamed of a generation that had forgotten how to behave. Another person commented below, "No need to scream, no need to protest. Just by being silent, she made the world stop." The next morning, major newspapers began to report the news. On the front page of the New York Times, the headline appeared, "A Lesson in Dignity." Local television re-aired the clip, with the host's gentle narration, "In a world where people were too quick to react." A woman of color chose silence, and it was that silence that made justice resonate farther than any call for justice. From a small restaurant in Chicago, the story spread across America. It was no longer a story between Grace and Ethan, or between mother and son. It became a mirror of society where people began to ask themselves, if I were there, what would I do? Who would I be in this story? Media commentators called it the Grace phenomenon. They talked about her smile, not a smile of victory, but the smile of someone who understands that forgiveness is not weakness, but the height of human strength. On social media, the hashtags, "A Lesson in Dignity" and "Eastern Justice." And silence quickly went viral. People began sharing their personal stories, times when they were disrespected, and times when they chose to stay silent, not out of fear, but because they knew that responding with intelligence is always more powerful than responding with anger. A white man writes, "She reminds me of my mother, who was refused service at a Southern restaurant in 1968. If she were alive, she would be proud of this woman." A young girl commented under the video, "I used to think justice only came with a scream. Now I understand sometimes. It comes with a smile." In David Thompson's office, the phone rang constantly. Reporters called. TV stations wanted interviews. Social organizations offered cooperation. David did not answer immediately. He just looked at the screen, where millions of people were sharing his mother's story, and smiled silently. "We don't need to say anything more," he told his staff. "Let people feel it for themselves." Then he turned back to look at the photograph hanging on the wall, a picture of Grace, the day the restaurant opened, her gentle smile, her bright eyes. He whispered, "Mom, now everyone knows who you are." Grace was sitting in an old armchair in her small house. The light from the television was on her face as the evening news replayed the story. The anchor said Grace Thompson, the 72-year-old woman who made the whole country stop and think about two words, respect. She didn't smile. She just looked down at the teacup in her hand, stirred it gently, then put down her spoon. A tear rolled down her cheek, not because she was sad, but because she knew sometimes God chooses ordinary people to teach the world extraordinary things. Her whole neighborhood started to take notice. Neighbors came knocking on her door, bringing flowers, cakes, and thank you notes. One middle-aged woman said, "Grace, I showed that video to my daughter. She said, 'Mommy, I want to be as calm as her when I grow up.'" She smiled slightly and replied in a soft voice, "We can all be like that. Just remember that we don't need to raise our voices to be heard." On forums, people are not just talking about racism anymore. They are talking about human dignity. One university professor wrote an analysis calling her story a metaphor for contemporary America. We are still learning to live together, but only when we learn to silently listen to each other's pain will we truly progress. Lectures on ethics and social justice at many universities began using the video as a discussion material. Teachers replayed the moment when Miss Grace said the line, "This isn't about a reservation, it's about respect." Then asked the students, "Who do you think she was talking to when she said that? Was it the waiter? Or was it the whole society? Even those in the service industry share their feelings. One hotel employee wrote on Twitter, "Since watching Grace's videos, I look at my customers differently. Not everyone who looks simple is meaningless. Sometimes, they are the ones teaching you a lesson about yourself." A New York taxi driver writes, "She didn't just embarrass Ethan. She made the whole country look in the mirror." And so, the Golden Spoon suddenly became a place of kindness. People didn't come just to eat. They came to touch what had become a symbol. David had a small plaque hung by the entrance, engraved with the words, "Respect is not given. It is lived." No one leaves there without a little reflection, a little warmth, and the belief that the world still has people who choose justice with kindness. One afternoon later, Grace returned to the restaurant. No more camera flashes, no more applause, just her familiar cup of tea, and her satisfied smile. It seemed like the end of the story, but in fact, it was just the beginning of something bigger, a symbol of change. A few months after the incident, the Golden Spoon restaurant changed completely, not with a new sign or a more luxurious interior, but with an atmosphere something people can't see, but feel as soon as they walk in. On the wall, behind the reception desk, is a picture of Mrs. Grace, a gentle smile, bright eyes. Below it is a line that David had engraved, "Respect is not given. It is lived." No one in the restaurant considered it a motto anymore. They read it every morning before they started their shift. And gradually, it became a guiding principle, a gentle but poignant reminder of how people should treat each other. David Thompson stood in the large conference room that had once been used for earnings calls. Today, the room was packed with employees, dishwashers, servers, and managers. No one wore a suit or tie. David stepped forward, the light illuminating his face. He said, his voice calm but firm, "From today, we will start a new program, Diversity and Respect Initiative. Not for the media, not for the image, but because we need to remember why this place was built." A few employees nodded. Those who had witnessed the incident with Grace still remembered that day clearly, the day they learned that a smile can be more powerful than power. David doesn't invite famous speakers or hire PR consultants. He invites real people, former employees, customers who have been treated unfairly, and people who have made mistakes. During one of the first classes, Ethan showed up. He was no longer in his staff uniform, just a young man in a simple shirt. He walked up, looked at everyone, and said, "I was wrong. I used to think that respect was only for people with money and power. But that day, I understood people with true dignity are people who make you look back at yourself." The room was dead silent. A female waitress placed her hand on her chest, as if to steady her pounding heart. David just nodded silently. He didn't need to say more. The change had begun, not with promises, but with awareness. Meanwhile, the press continued to highlight the story as a prime example of social transformation that begins with kindness. Other restaurants in the area contacted the Golden Spoon to request the respect training model. Some even hung Grace's quote on their doors, "Respect is not given, it is lived." The story is no longer just about the Thompson family. It has become a small movement about an ethic of service, about seeing others as we see ourselves. One late afternoon, the golden sunlight poured in through the windows. The restaurant door opened. Mrs. Grace walked in. Everyone stopped, not because she was the owner's mother, but because her presence made them feel calm. David approached, smiling. "I've been waiting for the day you come back." "Mom, justice cannot be a memory." "My son," she replied softly, "it must live on in every small act." He nodded, his voice trembling. "We do it. Mom. Every day." Mrs. Grace chose the familiar corner of the table where that argument had once taken place. The new waiter approached, not afraid, but with a sincere smile. "What would you like to have today?" She looked up, her eyes gentle. "As always, a cup of tea, no sugar." The girl nodded, then quietly retreated. No one knew that, at that moment. The hearts of everyone in the restaurant sank a feeling of gratitude, an awakening. When the teacup was set down, Grace sat and looked out the window. The street was quiet this afternoon. The sun stretched out on the pavement. The light reflected off the glass like a mirror. In it, she saw herself not the woman who had been wronged, but the one who taught the world to face injustice with kindness. David walked over and gently placed his hand on his mother's shoulder. She turned and smiled. He asked softly, "Are you happy?" She nodded, her eyes shining with the light that only those who have suffered and still choose to love can possess. "Yes, son. Because in the end, we don't just change a restaurant. We change the way people look at each other." The camera slowly pulled back. A golden light filled the scene. Mrs. Grace stood up, picked up her small bag, and walked slowly toward the door. Everyone in the restaurant watched, silent, not out of ceremony, but out of respect. As she stepped outside, the afternoon sun fell on her shoulders, making her silver hair sparkle. She paused at the door and looked back at the sign that hung on it. "Respect is not given. It is lived." She smiled, nodded slightly, and walked away. A soft piano melody began to play, a sad yet hopeful melody. The door closed. The light dimmed. The last line that appears on the screen, "Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet smile that changes the world." When the audience leaves the theater, or when the YouTube screen fades to black, what remains is not anger or tears, but a small question in each person's heart. Have I been kind enough to someone today? There are times in life when we are tested not by adversity, but by how we treat others when we think we have more power than them. The story waiter refused to serve. Elderly black woman, not knowing her son. Owned the restaurant is not just about racism or status discrimination, but deeper a lesson about dignity, respect, and kindness. Grace Thompson did not choose anger when offended. She chose wisdom and calmness. It was that calmness that changed a person, a restaurant, and spread to millions of hearts. She reminded us that justice does not need to be loud sometimes. Just a forgiving smile is enough to make others look back at themselves. In a fast-paced world where people are quick to judge by appearances, this story reminds us that respect is not an act of giving, but a way of life. Learn to listen, understand, and see the value in every person, no matter who they are. If this story touches you, please click like, share with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel to spread more humane stories, where kindness, justice, and humanity still exist in this world. Thank you for taking the time to listen.